We'll call the Wednesday, June 5th, 2024 meeting of the Planning Commission to order. I get to do the gavel. Mr. Trainer, can you do roll call?
Yep. Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Mr. Krasner?
I'm here.
Ms. Comont?
Here.
And Mr. Hyra? Here. Thank you. We have a quorum.
Great. So we need to adopt our agenda.
Madam Chair, I move to adopt the meeting agenda.
Second.
Okay, moved by Mr. Duncan, second by, I'm not sure who got that first, Mr. Krasner. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, no speaker series tonight. Mr. Trainer, do we have any written correspondence that you could summarize?
We do. We have a couple items, too, that came in too late to be added to the agenda, but I'll just summarize. The first one that did make into the agenda was from Mary Chavez. She wrote in on the accessory dwelling units update initiative that is forthcoming, and council recently had a scope of work session on. In her letter, Ms. Chavez noted several considerations for staff to consider, for the city to consider when going through the public engagement and updating process, and also linked to several resources, including the Falls Church Pulse and the Village Preservation and Improvement Society resources that I found very helpful. The other two items are we received comment from Anthony Fusarelli Jr., AICP, the planning director at Arlington County, on the demographics chapter update of the comprehensive plan, people, housing, and jobs, writing in general support and acknowledgement of the draft plan as currently presented, and was especially appreciative of the chapter's acknowledgement that dynamic populations and housing needs will be an important consideration in the city's pursuit and formulation of inclusive housing policies. And the other item was on the parking proposed text amendment that the commission has a work session on tonight. Writing against the proposal and citing concerns with existing parking capacity in the city. And that was from Rosalie Cosbelt.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And do we have any in-person petitions?
We do have one in-person speaker, Jean Gresco, 120 North Fairfax Street.
Thanks, guys.
Welcome, Jean.
Thank you. Again, I'm Gene Gresco, and I live on North Fairfax Street. My comments relate to the planning staff's ADU roadmap that was presented to the City Council on May 20th, specifically the issues to consider. All the presented issues are fine, but they exclude the most important, namely quantifying the benefits of accessory dwelling units. At that meeting, we heard three potential benefits. The first being an assumption that ADUs provide affordable housing. But Mayor Hardy subsequently stated that ADUs are not affordable, thus eliminating that claim from any justification. We then heard that although not affordable, ADUs would provide another avenue for needed housing. Our planners should be able to model that potential increase. Lastly, we heard that although ADUs might prevent smaller homes from being replaced by McMansions, housing studies should be researched to see if that assumption is substantiated. The presented issues to consider all related to the how of ADUs, but the Planning Division must first clearly establish the why with quantifiable data. Only then can citizens effectively weigh the merits of this potential zoning change. Thanks for adding this benefit determination to the project.
Great, thank you for your comments. Okay, so we have our first action item. It's the Demographic Comprehensive Plan Chapter Update, and this is a public hearing. Mr. Stoddard, would you like to introduce the item?
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Comont and members of the commission. I'm happy to introduce the item before turning it over to our lead staffer on this one, Ms. Emily Bazemore. The item before you is TR 2410, which is a resolution to amend the comprehensive plan to update Chapter 2, titled People, Housing, and Jobs, the demographics chapter of the city's comprehensive plan. The request tonight, as you mentioned, is to hold a public hearing on this item, and then for you to make a recommendation to City Council on the proposed updates to the chapter. By way of schedule, the City Council is scheduled to hold their public hearing and take final and consider final action at their next meeting, which is on Monday, June 10th, a little less than a week from today. In terms of recommendations, staff does recommend approval of the proposed motion. You all last saw this at a joint work session with the Housing Commission on May 15th of this year, 2024, and the updates since that joint work session are highlighted in gray in the report as well as in the attached proposed chapter. With that, by way of setup, I will turn it over to our lead staffer, Ms. Emily Bazemore.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, Planning Commission. Tonight, the Planning Commission is requested to hold a public hearing and make a recommendation to City Council on the updated demographics chapter. City Council is scheduled to hold a public hearing and take final action next Monday on June 10th of 2024. Staff recommends approval of the proposed motion included in the staff report. Updates to the staff report as well as the draft chapter since the May 15th Joint Planning Commission and Housing Commission work session are highlighted in gray. Beginning on line 21, you'll see a comments matrix, and there are comments from the City Council work session back on May 20th covered, as well as comments from the Planning Commission and Housing Commission work session on May 15th covered. There are a couple of themes that you'll see throughout the matrix. These are chapter, purpose, organization, and process, data, trends, and projections, housing, employment and economy, and of course, strategies. Throughout this process, there's been a robust amount of public engagement done around the chapter update. The staff report covers this on line 23. And I just want to kind of delve into that a little bit. So the draft updated chapter was reviewed by the following boards and commissions throughout the months of March and April of 2024. We have the Architectural Advisory Board, the Urban Forestry Commission, the Economic Development Authority, the Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation, the Recreation and Parks Advisory Board, the Human Services Advisory Council, the Environmental Sustainability Council, the Arts and Humanities Council, and of course also the Housing Commission and Planning Commission and City Council. In addition to boards and commissions review, the draft chapter was open for review by the general public through informational pop-ups at the following locations. We had 2 at Mr. Brown's Park downtown. We also had 1 at the Farmers Market. Additionally, in collaboration with FCC TV, we produced an informational video about the updated demographics chapter, and it can be viewed on the project webpage as well as our city YouTube and our cable channel. Additionally, we also had updates on the project included in the city's newsletter, which is The Focus. Moving on to line 67 of the staff report, we just want to give a little overview of the comprehensive plan, as this is a comprehensive plan amendment. So the city's comprehensive plan is a policy document that guides physical development and investment into the city. The comprehensive plan is a long-range plan that looks 20 to 25 years into the future. The plan includes an overarching vision for the city and guidance for different topics, including those like land use, economic development, community character, natural resources, parks and recreation, transportation, housing, and historic preservation. The demographics chapter provides important demographics data, including trends and projections of the city's population, housing, and employment. The data provided by the demographics chapter supports informed decision-making by City Council, the Planning Commission, and advisory boards and commissions and city staff when drafting policies, planning, and providing services to the community. Specifically, this chapter, Chapter 2, People, Housing, and Jobs, was last updated back in 2019. So here we are 5 years later, updating this chapter once again. Moving on to line 103, I just want to touch on the approval process. So section 17.06 of the city charter enables the Planning Commission to prepare and adopt individual components of the comprehensive plan, after which the Planning Commission must submit a certified copy to the City Council for its approval. The final approved comprehensive plan must then be sent by the Planning Commission to the clerk of the Circuit Court for Arlington County, who will file the comprehensive plan among its records. The Planning Commission will ultimately make a recommendation to City Council regarding the updated demographics chapter, and then City Council will take final action. All right, moving on to page 10 of the staff report. I just want to look at timing really quick before I wrap it up. So I just want to highlight that this project kicked off back in October of 2023. And here we are on June 5th of 2024, back at Planning Commission, this time for a recommendation to City Council. Again, we go to City Council on June 10th, so next Monday for our final action public hearing. And that's all from me. I'm looking forward to you guys' feedback. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ms. Bazemore. So this is a public hearing, so I think I can open this item to the public. Do we have anybody registered to speak on this item, Mr. Trainer?
No, Madam Vice Chair, I don't have any registered speakers.
Okay, so we can close the public hearing.
That was quick.
Any discussion from Planning Commission members?
I don't have much to say, but do you mind if I say a couple? I mean, I would just say that I'm glad that we did this. It's really important for us to have data to make informed decisions, and to have the demographic chapter be updated is really critical, right? That's kind of our base. And I mean, it's to be seen. We sometimes have data, but we choose policies that don't link up with the data, but at least we have it. And I'm glad that it's being inserted, and I think it's well done. You know, and Paul and I talked about, you know, some of the recommendations, and I think the recommendations are fine, but, you know, just the recommendations based on the data doesn't necessarily mean that the Planning Commission or the City Council will adopt those recommendations. So it's a planning tool, and it's great to have the best data, the most advanced data, the most updated data while we're trying to make policy decisions. And it definitely shows the high-income people moving in, the low-income people moving out, the limited number of affordable units that we have. I think it's crystal clear, and now we've got to think about, and we have been thinking about, how do we produce development that brings in a tax base so we can pay for the things that we have in the city, but also opens up the opportunity structure. And what I mean by that is that provides affordable housing, because there's a huge demand by the people who come and work in our city. There's a huge demand of people that are just outside of our boundaries, who would love to get access to our incredible schools. And I just hope that this data helps to inform some policy changes going forward, that we do development that's equitable, that has an affordable housing component, so we can give people greater access to our wonderful community. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hyra. Mr. Krasner?
Sure. I would align myself generally with Mr. Hyra's comments. I mean, first off, I think state code requires that comprehensive plans include demographics section. That's for a reason, because, if you don't know what the demographic trends are, it's very difficult to plan. And so it's vitally important that we update this section maybe, more frequently than even some of our others, because, making sure that you're aware and on top of the trends is vitally important. And it also, sometimes it provides you data that's surprising. A lot of times what it does is, there's things maybe you intuitively have a sense of, but it crystallizes it into actual hard data. And the income data, that Mr. Hyra just alluded to about, the city residents and those who are moving in versus moving out was quite telling as far as some of the trends that are ongoing here. I mean, we've had growth in population, the last couple of years notwithstanding, over the last decade. But it hasn't been an even type of growth. I mean, there's a certain demographic that has been, moving in greater numbers based on who can afford to live here. So it does sort of, again, put the data out there to show that, when certain policies are discussed, at this commission and at the council, that, it's not sort of the sky is falling type of mentality that's based on sort of again, people's opinions. It's based on data about what's actually occurring here, and is that a trend that we like, or is that a trend that we don't like? I mean, there are certain regional factors at play that we can't control, but we certainly can control some other factors within our boundaries, and this helps to lay out some of the challenges. And with that said, I thought it was, again, well researched and well presented. Early in my career, I did some demographic work, and so I always appreciate, good research and good crunching of the numbers in charts and graphs that make it easy to understand for the average person, and I think this does that. And yeah, so I didn't have any major concerns. I know I missed the work session on this a couple weeks ago. I was under the weather. But I wouldn't have really had much significant as far as revisions or major changes here. I think that I had seen earlier versions of it, and I think the final product that you wound up with is well done, and again, it's a vital part of what we need to lay out some policy changes for the city with respect to some of the demographic changes that we see that we don't like. There are some positive demographic changes in here, but for the ones that we feel maybe are problematic. This makes it clear where we're coming from. So that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Krasner.
Yep. Happy to support it. Yep.
Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. I'd like to return to that control over the factors that we have purview over point, because I think that's an interesting one. But first, I want to thank the staff for conducting another process of consideration of a complicated and multifaceted subject, doing a great job of outreach to the community, and especially listening and factoring in input from the boards and commissions. I've had a chance to go to or listen to several of them, and I think the final product reflects, the breadth of suggestions and opinions that were expressed in the meetings, at least I had access to. So thank you. Second, and I don't want to belabor this because I think we're all of like mind here and there's no sense in prolonging the meeting, but I think the Planning Commission might do a service for the council by spending a minute or two discussing how we would respond if we were sitting in the council seats to, what I have also seen in the public comment process, which is a certain ambivalence about a document that, relies obviously on regional trends. It includes Falls Church, but Falls Church is so tiny, is not, specifically Falls Church. It's basically looking at what's going on in our region in terms of people, housing, and jobs. And the lens that some folks who have expressed concern about the document is, we got too many people, we got too much housing, and jobs is just not really on their radar screen. It's the document is seen as by this group of people, I think, as providing providing a justification for the policies that we have pursued, moving from affordability at 6% in the mixed-use buildings to 12% in the most recent building at Founders 2, for instance, and other changes that the majority of people, I think, are supportive of in trying to build a more attainable housing structure, affordable and attainable, creating a 15-minute city that is truly walkable, where you can combine, dining, entertainment, shopping, all on foot within, a very reasonable distance of your home. And there's some folks who I've listened to who that's just not really what they see Falls Church becoming if they had their way. If they had their way, it would be the more traditional sort of approach of single-family homes, costing market rates, housing that was much less dense than we have built in recent years, and jobs which are basically outside our borders. People leaving Falls Church to do what it is they do for a living. And a certain population of folks who are imported to do the service work that needs to get done, but who, just don't have any prospect of ever living here because of the affordability concerns. It's a serious argument and a worldview that is, based on how folks view the world. But I think you're going to take this thing to the city council, and it's conceivable that some will either abstain or they'll vote against it, which seems peculiar given, what you've just heard here tonight and what you've heard in most of the meetings that you've been to. And I just wonder from my colleagues if they have any advice to how to respond to that, because it deserves being responded to. And if it's possible to, assure folks that this document that we are going to approve is a document that takes into consideration regional trends and the desire for jobs, housing, and people, but does so in a Falls Churchy kind of way. And by that I mean, walkable, attainable, affordable housing as a bigger component of our effort, and all the other aspects of the 15-minute city that we like to think we're building here and are getting some regional and even national recognition for doing. So that's the question I guess I would pose. And, we don't have to go on about it as long as I've gone out about it, but I do think it would be helpful for the council to be, and the staff, to be able to respond or at least react to that opposing mentality.
I'll respond to that. I appreciate that, Commissioner Duncan. And I think I'm aware of what you're alluding to as far as some of that sentiment. I guess, and I'm probably on this topic, probably more centrist, but I would say, one thing I think that's important that for staff, the council, for the public to keep in mind is that, because I do hear, occasionally arguments about, when you're talking about affordable housing and that challenge and the fact that, there's certain neighborhoods, none of us can afford to live in, and that's sort of the market and the economy. But, I think one thing to keep in mind is we have neighborhood qualities, but we're a city. We're an independent city. We're an independent jurisdiction in the Commonwealth. And when the city, in its wisdom, decided to incorporate, and become first there was a town, and then it became an independent city, which means in Virginia we're, as the word says, completely out on our own. I think that gives us also it gives us a lot of privileges and autonomy. I think it also gives us a responsibility. I don't think that that type of mentality that, there should be an incorporated, public municipality that, can sort of turn its back on and say that we're only for one kind of person. I think that we do have a responsibility. It may not be sort of expressed that way, like legally, perhaps, but, I would say that we have a responsibility to be equitable, to be open and inviting. We don't want to be seen as an enclave. So that's how I would respond to that. On the same token, I'm sensitive to, the concerns about, changes to sort of the traditional, built environment and the form in the residential parts of town and sort of that, I live in, a neighborhood where I certainly would be sensitive to dramatic changes in, sort of the built environment and the density. But with that said, we are a small jurisdiction and, so anyhow, I won't go on and on, but I think that's how I would respond, is that remembering that we are an independent municipality, and with that comes responsibility, and one of those is, again, being open and inclusive. That's how I would approach that.
I was just going to ask Ms. Bazemore, can you speak to the idea that this is more of a regional document rather than, because that's not really my understanding. I think there are some parts of this where there's like a little bit of piece of East Arlington that's included in our data, but really this is pretty laser focused on Falls Church.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. To sort of jump in here. So one, just in case there are any questions about the methodology, one thing, we wanted to make sure we had some rigor to our methods. So with the update 5 years ago, is sometimes you'll see people sort of do a demographic study where they pick a method and then they have like a high and a low and a medium, and that's not what we did. We went a different route. We used 3 different methods to see if they gave similar results, right? You tried 3 different statistical methods, and if you arrive on the same answer, then that gives you strong confidence in those results. And I think that's an approach that serves the city well, and so we carried that forward here. We used 3 different methods. We used age cohort, we used trend analysis, we used housing analysis, and they all landed on similar results. Because they do give us, historically, they've given us the most accurate results for the city. What's captured in the document itself is our housing-based projections, and like I said, that's consistent with the other methodologies we tried. The other thing that we started doing 5 years ago, and we did it again this time, was trying to figure out what's the right sort of comparative analysis, what's the right geography to compare ourselves to. So is it comparing Falls Church to all of Fairfax County? Probably not. Falls Church to all of Arlington County? Probably not that either. What we do look at when we compare the city's growth rates from a planning perspective is we think about how does the city's growth rate compare to other activity centers? So these are the places, Commissioner Duncan, you mentioned 15-minute cities, right? These are the places where people can live, they can find employment, they can find the local goods and services they need to carry out their day. These are the regional activity centers, the places people know throughout the region. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but they're all showing some level of growth. And Falls Church is actually right in the middle of that pack, both in the recent past as well as in these projections going forward. Falls Church is right in the middle of the pack for those activity centers. So I think that gives some level of comfort that the methodology is sound and that it's consistent with what we're seeing in the region, that this is an attractive place to live. People want to live here. They're willing to pay a lot of money to do it. But it is a region that has some stresses, that it has environmental stresses. We're doing better than we used to do, but we used to have a lot of code red days in the summer. The air quality used to be pretty poor. It's getting better. We have problems with traffic congestion. We have problems with people finding affordable housing in places that are closest to their jobs. So it is a region that has struggles, and there are regional strategies for dealing with that. And a lot of it is about this, trying to encourage sort of the population that is growing within the region to grow within these activity centers, so that people are already close to the things they want to do, the places they need to go, where they have to be to live their lives. And so there is a regional strategy, but there's a lot of alignment with the local vision. If you look at the vision chapter that the City Council adopted unanimously several years ago, we referenced that regularly. We referenced it in developing the strategies for this document, and it speaks to a commitment to growth, an environmentally sustainable city, an inclusive community, a welcoming community. And so I think if you look at the strategies that are in this chapter, I think you'll see those same principles playing out, right? That there are regional trends about what's happening that's consistent with what's happening in the city, and then the strategies that are put forward are really rooted in local values, those community values about being a welcoming, inclusive community.
Thank you, Mr. Stoddard. Did you want to reply, Mr. Duncan? Mr. Hyra?
Yeah, I just wanted to reply a little bit to Commissioner Duncan's comments, but they really relate to Councilmember Duncan and the 10 years plus that you were on the council. So a lot of the things that have happened in our town and that people either really appreciate or have angst about is the development, and a lot of the development that you were for. And I think a lot of the development that a lot of us on this planning commission were for. Some of those things we can control, some of them we can't. And I would say, I would bucket like that in our town. I think there is the pro-growth folks and the anti-growth folks. The pro-growth folks want upgrades, walkability, sustainability, density, and a tax base that can maintain our infrastructure, including our schools, our roads, sidewalks, parks, sewers, library. We can go on. And I think some of the anti-growth folks want those things, but don't want the density. And like this being a bedroom community, that they can travel out to their amenities, but within our town has the good schools, right? And so just enough tax base to keep our schools great. They can stay in their nice homes, and they can go elsewhere for their amenities. And that's sort of the tug of war that's going on. And I like the density. I like that we're walkable. I like that we've increased our density on plots, and we've been doing that. But I think we need to think about, but does that make us isolationists or inclusiveness? And I think we're getting a little mixed up with that density and sustainability and the growth, thinking that's making us more inclusive. That all has happened, all the growth and the density and maybe the walkability and diversification, but at the same time, we actually have become more isolated. And what I mean by that is that only really rich people can live here. We haven't really made it more inclusive. And I think that's why I joined the Planning Commission, to try to figure out how can we build sustainable, more dense, more walkable, and more equitable, and more inclusive. But if we look at the numbers, we see, let me pull it up, that who's coming into our town, I don't know, page 23, household income. Households that make under or over 200,000 used to be 25% of our population, 2012 to 2016. So that's sort of the time where we're doing development, and then 2017 to 2021, that population becomes 35% of our town. So we have done development that has brought in a population that is even wealthier than before. So, and then what do we see has happened with the household incomes for people who've made under 50,000? They went from 17% of the population to 11%. So it's sort of like this pro-growth, anti-growth, that's one battle, but the other battle is exclusivity, inclusivity. And we've become more exclusive and not more inclusive. And I think we have to use these numbers, think about the data, think about our policies, work on being more dense, more walkable, more sustainable, reduce our carbon footprint, provide tax base for all the amenities and the great schools that are here, but become more inclusive, and more inclusive by building a housing stock so that it's at 11% for people who make 50,000 and under. Maybe in 10 years from now, that'll be back up to 17%. But it will only be back up if we as a city decide to invest and build affordable housing. Without that, it's just going to get worse. If we let the market do what the market's doing in our region, this will become an even wealthier and wealthier area, and we'll have less and less and less low-income people. But what I get worried about is the pro-growth, anti-growth people. I don't think they really care. I think they're like, yeah, let's have it wealthier and be anti-growth, or let's be pro-growth and make it wealthier. So I just don't know, within the divide that I think you alluded to, where do we fit in that inclusivity? And I do hear a lot of people on the pro-growth side talk about we are more inclusive. That's wrong. The data shows we're not. This demographic, it's just Appendix D. You just have to look at it. It's not very complicated. We're becoming more exclusive than inclusive. So I don't know if that answered you or, but it was a comment based on what you said. But I would end by saying, I do love the growth. We have to become more dense. We've got to keep expanding. We have more population. We have more needs. Things just get pricier and pricier. But we've got to find the leverage to be more inclusive, or we're just telling ourselves a lie. And Mr. Krasner, I have to comment to his, is that he mentioned we became an independent city. When did we become an independent city? We moved from a township to an independent city in 1948. We did that because restricted covenants became unenforceable. We couldn't redline people out of this town, so we decided to become our own municipality, to have our own school system, and to try to control the demographics of this place. And that is the history of Falls Church. And we do work really hard to try to address that history. But I think all the things that we try to do haven't made a big dent. We're not doing restricted covenances, but we're building buildings that are unaffordable to a lot of people. And we have racial inequality along income and wealth lines. And if we keep just growing in an affluent, exclusive fashion, we're going to become more or less racially diverse. And we're just doing something that's different than restricted covenants is. And I know we didn't want to do that, but the data is sort of saying we did that unintentionally. So we've got to do better.
Thank you, Mr. Hira. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion. And thank you, Ms. Bazemore, for all of your efforts on this. I think the chapter is great. It's a really terrific base of facts, as you heard here tonight, for future decision-making. And I think the strategies are really comprehensive and thoughtful. So I hope we can execute them to support the vision statement that we have as Chapter 1 of our comprehensive plan. In the year 2040, the City of Falls Church is a welcoming and inclusive community. So I'd like to see us realize that statement. I don't want those to just be empty words. So I very much agree with Mr. Hira that we need to figure out how to get there, if that's really where we want to be. And there may be people who say that's where they want to be, but maybe it's not really where they want to be. So anyway, good discussion. Any other comments? Thank you, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Krasner. Do we have a motion? It's a little long.
I can do it. I got
All right,
it.
thank you, Mr. Krasner.
My eyes are not as young as they used to be, but I can still read it.
Better than mine.
Well, you know, it's amazing. You wake up and you're 46, and the glass. I had to order a pair of those glasses because, like, it just hits you like that. You think that's never happening to me, and then it does. But I can, if I hold this or push this far enough back, I'm good. Okay. Okay. So this is this is TR 2410, a resolution to amend the comprehensive plan to update Chapter 2, People, Housing, and Jobs, Demographics chapter of the city's comprehensive plan. So whereas the Virginia Code, Section 15.2, 2223 requires that the city have a comprehensive plan for the city that considers, among other things, the needs of the residents of the city, and consideration of those needs requires an understanding of the number of residents and their attributes. And whereas Section 17.04 of the city charter makes the Planning Commission responsible for preparation of the city's comprehensive plan, and whereas Section 17.06 of the city charter enables the Planning Commission to prepare and adopt individual components of the comprehensive plan, and whereas Section 15.2-2228 of State Code also gives the City Council the authority to grant final approval to the comprehensive plan changes previously approved by the Planning Commission, and whereas People, Housing, and Jobs was developed with substantial public engagement that included pop-up events, an informational video for the general public produced in collaboration with Falls Church City Television and reviewed by the city's advisory boards and commissions. And whereas People, Housing, and Jobs identifies connections and strategies to place the demographic trends and projections in perspective of city functions such as access and belonging, housing availability and affordability, employment, public infrastructure, facilities and services, transportation, climate and sustainability, and changing conditions, planning strategies for projected future needs of the city. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Planning Commission of the City of Falls Church, Virginia, that Chapter 2, People, Housing, and Jobs Demographics chapter of the city's comprehensive plan, which is attached hereto, is hereby, or will be attached, is hereby adopted by the Planning Commission as an updated demographics chapter of the city's comprehensive plan, replacing the version of Chapter 2 that was adopted on August 12th, 2019, and that the Planning Commission recommends that the City Council grant final approval of the updated chapter, People, Housing, and Jobs Demographics chapter of the city's comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Mr. Krasner. Is there a second?
There's only two choices, Derek. You or me second?
It's up to you.
I defer.
All right, I second.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Trainer, can you call the roll?
Well, any discussion?
Oh, sorry,
I don't
any
have any.
discussion
Just
on the
checking.
motion?
Just
Yeah,
checking.
thank you.
I thought we had a lot of discussion already. No more.
Checking, making sure no one wants to tweak the motion.
I'm not pushing my button on that, finger on that button.
Yeah, I think the motion is good,
Yeah.
as prepared.
Okay,
I think we're good. Motion and a
all
second,
right.
yeah.
Mr. Trainer?
Mr. Duncan,
Yes?
Mr. Krasner,
Yes.
Mr. Hyra,
Yes.
and Ms. Comat.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Basenor.
Yes, thank you. Good work on this.
Thank you, good Lord.
Okay. So our next action item is our minutes from May 15th, 2024. Did you catch anything, Mr. Duncan, with your eagle eye?
I think on line 163, we have me doing something about and for both. And I think it's either about or for. Take your pick, Jack.
Maybe the 4.
Yeah, I think the for might be the way to go. I didn't see anything else, but my eyes are, as I said,
Yeah, these are continuing to be
I'm-
terrific minutes, Mr.
and they're terrific in their
Thank you.
detail. I told Paul that I might request a larger font size so that I can,
I second that.
I mean, I've literally got my magnifying glass out now, so it's my problem, but at any rate, so if there's nothing else, I move to approve the minutes of the meeting of whatever that is,
May 15th.
May 15th.
May 15th, sorry, as amended.
Second, any second? I can second.
I wasn't there
Oh,
either.
you weren't there.
Yeah,
Oh.
just you,
We will approve.
Yeah, I think, I've checked this out in my day job, and even if you're not at a meeting, you can still vote to
Still
approve
vote. Okay,
the minutes.
okay. I'll second.
As long as you're okay with that, yeah.
All in favor?
aye.
Aye.
I actually watched it on TV, believe it or not. I'm that
Dedicated.
sad that I was
That
home sick with a
dedicated.
cold, and I was still watching you guys. You were in the other room,
Yeah.
All right.
interesting, actually.
We are a little ahead of schedule. So our next item is a work session item. the commercial building parking relief zoning amendment. Mr. Stoddard, would you like to introduce this?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Coma, members of the commission. I'm happy to introduce the item before I turn it over to our lead staffer on this, who is Mr. Jack Trainer. So the item, as you mentioned, this is a work session item for you tonight. This is on TO 2411, ordinance to amend the zoning code of the City of Falls Church. It's a text amendment. City of Falls Church, Chapter 48, zoning, Article 5, supplementary regulations, Division 2, off-street parking requirements to exclude the first 1,000 square feet of individual commercial uses in off-street parking requirement calculations. So the request, jumping down to line 4, the request tonight is for you all to hold a first work session on this item. As you'll see, as Mr. Trainer walks through the proposal, what's in front of you is a tailored text amendment to the zoning ordinance, and really at its core, what it's intending to do is try to make it easier for existing commercial buildings when tenants move out, to make it easier to re-tenant those spaces and open up, especially some of the city's older buildings, to a wider variety of tenants. Today, there are a lot of uses that people find desirable are actually excluded by the zoning ordinance from moving in the first place. And so it really is a tailored solution to that situation. You are asked to hold your first work session tonight. In terms of timing, council has requested that you respond no later than August 2nd of 2024. So looking into the recommendation section, that is why staff is recommending that you do go ahead and schedule a public hearing on this item at your July 26th meeting for a public hearing and recommendation back to council. But with that, by way of introduction, I'll turn it over to our lead staffer, Mr. Jack Trainer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stoddard. And giving Vice Chair Coman, members of the commission, I'm going to jump over to the City Council staff report that was included as the first attachment here, since Mr. Stoddard already went through the request and recommendation tonight. Before I get into the substance of the proposal itself, I'll walk through a little bit of background and explore a little bit more on the motivation behind the proposal, a lot of which was in the scope of work that the commission already reviewed, so I'll just touch on a couple of things. Then we'll get into the details of the proposal. And then we've also included a couple examples kind of illustrating how the proposal is meant to function and work in removing some of those parking barriers that Mr. Stoddard touched on. And then I'll jump back to the Planning Commission staff report and walk through the public meeting schedule that's included. So by way of background, on October 16th, 2023, the City Council received a presentation from Newmark, that was titled Retail Landscape and Opportunities, which highlighted that many of the city's existing commercial and retail stock are older buildings with smaller footprints, smaller than what's being built today. The report also highlighted that these same buildings present an opportunity, particularly for smaller and independent businesses to move into because of their lower credit and rent rates that are typically associated with these older and smaller buildings. But the problem that arises is that these same buildings were built before the city's off-street parking requirements were enacted, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But that presents a barrier where there's fixed parking that small and independent businesses might not be able to meet on site because of the uses and the corresponding parking requirements in our zoning ordinance can lock them out. So what this specific proposal is doing, as Mr. Stoddard says, a tailored kind of intervention to kind of remove that parking barrier, to open up our existing commercial buildings to more uses, and as the examples will show, are particularly aimed at benefiting smaller businesses. So to touch on current parking utilization, the city contracted Walter Consultants in 2020 to look at downtown parking utilization in the city. That report is also attached to the staff report. Generally, what it found is that despite certain hotspot areas and times in the downtown, that there is adequate parking supply and even an excess parking is available during the peak use hours. So related to that, going to our current off-street parking requirements and some relief options that exist today, this table was included in the scope of work that the Planning Commission held, comparing the space requirements for parking compared to the actual square footage of the uses themselves. Most notably, we highlight that restaurants require 3 times as much parking space as it does to the usage space. And sort of as a sidebar, just today I was looking at the original off-street parking ordinance that the city adopted in 1969, and it was almost exactly the same regulations as we're still using today, which I thought was eye-opening, and this table that we include here kind of illustrates that point as well. So another kind of point to raise about the proposed ordinance is that there are existing relief options for new development tied to the site plan procedures, where folks that come in for a site plan can include a request for parking reductions through submission of a TDM or parking management plan. But today there's not a kind of clear procedure for existing commercial uses requesting parking relief where parking is non-conforming. So this proposal specifically gets at that. And so with that, I'll get into what the kind of substance and the details of the proposal itself. As mentioned at the top, the proposal is to exclude the first 1,000 square feet of new commercial use in parking calculations when moving into an existing commercial building, provided a couple points. The first condition is that the building changing use does not have a recorded site plan with an approved transportation demand management plan or parking management plan already on file, aka there's not already a parking reduction associated with the site. 2, that the new use is not within a shopping center as defined by the zoning ordinance, and we've provided that definition here on line 79. And lastly, the third condition is that the new use's off-street parking requirements are calculated using square feet instead of some other method as some uses do, but the majority of commercial uses in the zoning ordinance do use square feet for their parking calculations. And so with that, I'll walk through a couple examples. I'm going to talk about 2 specific examples to show here. If I need to blow this up, I can. And before I get into the examples themselves, I want to talk a little bit about the methodology we used for this analysis. We used CoStar data primarily. The city has a CoStar subscription that informed much of this analysis, and which was helpful in a lot of ways, but it kind of lacked tenant-specific data, particularly tenant sizes. So to kind of get around that, we used basically the entire building square footage acting as a single use for the purposes of this analysis to highlight the effect. So just to keep that in mind, but in real life, a parking reduction would be tied to specific commercial uses at time that they submit a certificate of occupancy, and so would be associated with smaller commercial spaces than entire buildings typically. But so let me get into the 2 examples here. So the first is 706 South Washington Street, built in 1950. It's currently used as a professional office. The building area or tenant space is 1,600 square feet, and there are 8 off-street parking spaces on site. So if we go down to this table here on line 102 and look at this middle column, existing parking requirement, these are the spaces that are required today, depending on the commercial use, and we've selected just common commercial uses here for illustration purposes. So salons and civic and fraternal uses require 49 and 27 spaces, respectively, based on, again, this tenant space area of 1,600 square feet. and restaurants would require 17 spaces. The white rows kind of illustrate uses that require both more parking before and after the proposed amendment, but I want to look at, if we go down to the restaurant space, which requires 1 space per 100 square feet of customer area. That 17 that's required today, once the 1,000 square foot reduction is applied to get to this new calculated area of 600 square feet, the parking required decreases by 10 spaces, and it's suddenly down to 7, which the site can accommodate. Because remember, there's 8 spaces on site. So a restaurant space essentially becomes unlocked on this site by reducing that the parking barrier. And then the remaining uses are uses that that the site already provides enough parking for before and after. So one last thing on this example is I want to highlight that this would be a 62% reduction, parking reduction on this site. And you'll see why that becomes important at my next example, which I want to look at 106 Little Falls Street. It's an older building built in 1860, also used as an office use. The building area is 3,500 square feet, so it's about twice the size as the last example. And there's 15 spaces on site. Now, if we look at the restaurant space again, 36 spaces would be provided for, or 36 spaces are needed for a restaurant of the building size, 3,500 square feet, and 26 are needed at the reduced size of 2,500 square feet, and that's still out of reach for this site. But 2 more uses become unlocked here, apparel and accessory repair and business service uses through that reduction. And this reduction at this size represents a 28% reduction. So this is an example, and I wanted to highlight these 2 because it shows that the larger that the commercial use gets, the smaller the parking relief becomes. And so larger commercial uses will still be required to park a bigger bulk of their parking requirements, and that this proposal, would disproportionately benefit smaller existing commercial uses. We've included a couple other examples here, but I'm going to move on. This proposal does advance several council priorities in the economic development and environmental sustainability priorities, particularly around being business-friendly in the city and making more efficient use of our existing parking that we have in the city. But another environmental benefit of the prolonged longevity of our existing commercial buildings is that we avoid the demolition environmental costs or other environmental detriments that are associated with new construction and demolition specifically. So another environmental benefit to keep in mind. And lastly, before I go back to the public engagement schedule, I want to talk a little bit about how staff landed on the 1,000 square feet metric. We looked at 50-odd certificates of occupancy for new businesses applying to open up shop in the city over the last couple years. And that's where that true kind of tenant space data lies, unfortunately not with CoStar. So it's a much more manual kind of laboring process, but we looked at 50 and we put them into quartiles that you can see here on line 151. And the top of quartile 2, which captures the smallest 50% of the tenant spaces areas that we looked at, is just over 1,300 square feet. So we thought that 1,000 square feet isn't only just a kind of nice round number, but also would make a significant dent for the smallest of the commercial tenant areas in the city. And also, would do something for larger areas as well with some mitigation for overflow and over parking. So let me jump back over. I'll conclude now with the public engagement schedule. Oh, I also want to acknowledge that we have a comment response matrix here as well from the City Council. First reading from May 28th. I won't walk through all of these, but if there's specific questions, I'm happy to return to them. So on the timing section, City Council had their first reading and referral of this item on May 28th, last Tuesday, referred it to both the Planning Commission and the Economic Development Authority. The EDA had their work session and made their recommendation last night. The EDA, their recommendation was approval of the proposal and also recommended actually increasing the exemption to 1,200 square feet. Planning Commission is obviously having their work session tonight. And tomorrow morning, I just found out actually is the Falls Church Chamber of Commerce Legislative Committee's meeting. So they'll be having this briefing tomorrow morning. And City Council also requested that we go to the CICT and the Environmental Sustainability Council. So those groups will be receiving this briefing and providing input as well in June. So following that input, we'll return to the proposal, make any adjustments based on the feedback that we hear before coming back for final consideration for the Planning Commission's public hearing and City Council's consideration in July and August. So I'll wrap up there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Trainer. I'll defer to my colleagues, Mr. Duncan.
Just thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Just one process question. So last night at the EDA, they voted for 1,200 square feet. And my understanding from what the city attorney said was that that's still within the bounds of substantially the same as 1,000 that they got on first reading. So if the number didn't land on 1,000, but rather on a larger number, it would not have to go back through again for first reading. Did I hear that right at the meeting last night?
That's correct, Mr. Duncan. The city attorney, couldn't provide, or it's difficult to provide a ceiling number that would cause a new first reading. So basically, my understanding is that anything that's justifiable with the data provided could be considered without returning to a new first reading. So that's partly why we included how we arrived at that 1,000 square feet, and that was partly, I think, how the EDA made their decision to recommend 1,200 square feet.
Okay, thank you. So I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I mostly have, again, curiosity about what my colleagues think. A zealous application of the 15-minute city philosophy would, as the EDA discussed last night, remove the number altogether and let the market play out as it would. Let the owner of the new of the 1860 building, I think that's the one that's projected to be some sort of crepe array or whatever, however you pronounce that. And if we did not require 1,000, 1,200, whatever, then that owner would be rolling the dice as to whether they could run their business without any parking minimums. Those 8 spots or however many they could carve out would be what they had, and they would be relying on a lot of their customers to get there by foot or bike or scooter or Uber or whatever, some means that does not require them to have parking, which I thought was an interesting point. And I'd be curious to know what you all think about that. That did not ultimately prevail, but there was a serious discussion about it. And on the other side of the coin, what I'd like to know is those restaurants, particularly restaurants, I think, that do have a very limited number of parking spaces, whether it's the rotating restaurant there at the corner of Annandale and Maple, which has been 5 different things in recent memory and can't seem to sustain itself because it has, as far as I can tell, no parking at all. Leaders get flack for allowing that to happen. Like, how could you do that? You're just, dooming another business for, to fail because you're not providing parking for them. Well, that's an interesting question, but, 5 people have thought that they could make a go of it there and failed at it. Is that our business? Are we required to, provide an environment that discourages that from happening, or do we just let the market dictate? So, my inclination would be to go in the direction that the EDA went, and, try to institute some sort of more aggressive effort by the city's Economic Development Office to advise prospective tenants of low parking sites that, buyer beware. You're heading into a location that is going to require you to cater to a pedestrian, bike / all the other uses in order to succeed, because you are not going to have enough parking by any standard. That's just what occurred to me as I was listening to the EDA meeting last night. But I don't know, should we get out of this business? Should we experiment with trying what Arlington's done in many places, even residential places? No parking limits at all. That's how you get serious affordable housing, is you don't require parking.
Did you have thoughts, Mr. Krasner?
I have a couple thoughts. Well, yeah, I could respond to Mr. Duncan's points, but maybe first, before I do that, because I do have opinions on what Mr. Duncan said. First, just a couple questions. I understand, how the proposal would work. So, let's say a use was under 1,000 square feet. You're saying there's no parking requirement at all.
That's correct,
Right,
if it
right.
meets the other criteria.
Right, so if it's going into a building, now, and what about, how about a building that's has 1,500 square feet of retail space and is able to compartmentalize it into three 500 square foot uses? Do they have any parking requirement?
So it would be tied to the certificate of occupancy. So if the tenant space that it's going into is one of those 500 square feet bays, then it also would be excluded.
Right, so I'm saying if there were 3 different uses going
Yeah.
into each of the 3 spaces, the sum total requirement for all 3 parking requirement is 0.
That's right, because it would be each individual spaces. If the whole building consolidated into the 1,500 square feet, then they would have 500 square feet to park.
Okay, so those answers to, I think raises some issues that we should think about before we, and I understand fully, I'm a card-carrying AICP planner, and I fully understand, the high cost of free parking, as that famous book, talks about, and everything else. But there also are unintended consequences that we see, and there's also sort of mixed messages I've seen in this town when it comes to parking. On the one hand, people up on the commission and the city council do make a lot of noise about, let's have no parking requirements because we're a city. But then we also have been really keen on putting in this permit parking stuff, where free parking on the street that's supposed to be used for everybody is not allowed for everybody. I'm a taxpayer in the city, but I'm not allowed to park in Winter Hill if I wanted to park there. I don't live there. I can't park there. I can't park. I don't know how I would get a permit. I live around the corner from the parking restrictions that just went in place before Founders Row opened on West Street and Grove. I don't think I'm allowed to park there for more than 2 hours because I'm not allowed. I don't know who gets a permit for that if you have to live on that block. I don't. So on the other hand, we do have free public parking, but we've sort of restricted it in certain areas to protect, I don't know who, somebody. So to me that's kind of right. So because I think you can't reduce and get rid of parking minimums on private property because you still have to acknowledge that there needs to be. We can certainly nudge people to walk and bike and pogo stick and do anything else to get to some of these uses. But the reality of 2024 Falls Church and sort of our density levels and where we're at is we're just spread out enough that, there are certain areas of town where if you live on one side or the other where, you do, not that either you're not physically able to bike or walk, or pay an Uber. You don't want to pay an Uber, and so some people still will drive. Some percentage of people are still going to drive. And if we remove, if we have an unintended consequence where we wind up with a situation like we did with Northside Social, where sometimes what then winds up happening is we shift the burden onto private owners and people park illegally, and then they put up those signs and tow people, and then they complain about being towed, and then we start to get complaints. Well, how did you approve that with no parking? So, and I do think the market to some degree may self-regulate because certain owners are not going to want to go in to a site that doesn't have enough parking. I mean, certainly when you talk about like larger businesses, regional and national chains, they have very strict requirements for their leasing. They won't even look at sites that don't meet their requirements. That's not true for mom and pop, independent businesses. But so, all that to say, I think that we need to be a little bit careful in the sense of not introducing unintended consequences about that issue. And I don't know, I appreciate your explanation of where you kind of came up with the 1,000 square feet. I'm not saying that number is wrong, but I do think the idea that, again, you could have multiple uses, like let's say in the example you used in the 110, whatever it was, Little Fall Street, you could break that up into some different uses, and they might all attract their own customer base. And before you know it, they do have a problem and you might say, okay, well, that's whose problem is it? Well, if it spills over now onto into other properties, or if people start parking in neighborhoods, you're going to hear about it. And then you'll say, well, then the neighborhoods will say, like we had at the La Tingeria thing, where they said, we want permit parking, because you allowed a big restaurant to go in there with not enough parking. And it became a whole issue. And former zoning administrator Boyle said, we have this weird provision in our ordinance that you can't store cars on the street. But somehow there's 100 Saabs that are stored on the street around, over next to Founders Road 2. There's no permit parking there yet. Maybe there will be. And then you can park 100 Saabs there if you own 100 Saabs. So I don't know. This actually does kind of it's a quandary because I understand what we're trying to do, and we're trying to allow certain uses to have, or certain buildings and lots to have more opportunities if we're getting inquiries or their landlords are and they say, nope, you can't come in here because you don't have the parking. But I think we have to be careful. One last thing, and then I'll shut up, is that different uses also have different trip characteristics based on the time of day where they are at their peak. So I would argue that restaurants are very different than some of the other commercial uses you're talking about, like a salon, for example, that has its customer base spread out across many, many hours. A restaurant has its customer base concentrated in usually a couple hours, like if it's dinner, it's during the 3 or 4 hours of dinner, and then 1 or 2 during the midday for lunch. And and so you get into that issue where, that use, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't want to do that because all their customers are coming up at the same time, and it might, again, lead to these unintended consequences I alluded to earlier. So just things to think about, as far as before we just blanket, reduce it by that much on all uses and perhaps wind up with some unintended consequences. Maybe there's a way we can do it in a more targeted fashion, or even try it, maybe do a smaller trial of it and see how it goes. The other option would be to create a way to get a parking reduction that has a little bit of oversight, whether it's through an administrative process with staff, and the zoning administrator can kind of make a call, or, I don't want to, a special permit at the BZA, if you don't want to make it complicated and have to go to city council, maybe there's a special permit where they can look at it and don't call it a variance, but call it a special permit and for a parking reduction, and they get to then evaluate if it would work the way it's been proposed, and people who live around there can kind of say, wait a second, we've had a long-standing problem with customers of that business causing problems. I don't know, things like that. So those are my thoughts on it. I think that there's definitely merit in looking at it if, and a lot of our rates are out of date and they probably do require too much compared to today's, what we would consider to be the right size today. But I don't know if, we should just jump in with both feet without really thinking about it, because we might introduce problems that then our friends at council they'll be the first to hear about. We won't hear about it, but our friends on council will be the first to hear about it when, we've introduced a problem unintentionally. So those are just my thoughts, those caveats.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Hyra?
Wow. Brent, that was a lot.
That's all. I'm sorry.
It cares a lot. You do care a lot about parking. It's good. Because it's important.
It's the little things in the ordinance like that. I've been on the receiving end of it in other ways, and so I just.
Your mic is off.
Yeah.
Oh, now it's off. All right.
Yeah.
But parking gets a lot of emotional responses. And the council will feel that when changes are made. I mean, I would just say a couple things. I want to do like higher order. I think that we want to unlock the potential of our land for economic development. That's partly what you presented, right? I mean, that if we reduce the parking, we will get some stimulation in small business development. That's good for our town. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Also, we want to reduce our carbon footprint. We want more people driving less. That is good for all of us, our environment. Yes, I think we'll have a lot of people say yes. But Brent brought up a good point. With this policy that has great intentions on the economic development front and the environmental front, could have disastrous consequences that we haven't really thought about. Brent, you mentioned some of them, like there could be discrimination in the enforcement of this policy. We have seen that with La Tangeria. That business got shut down because people called and said, there are people parking on our street. And it's like, well, it's a public street. Anyone can park there. I don't even know why that triggered the business being shut down. But a Latino business that opened up that's highly successful, that a lot of people like, that were driving to it, all of a sudden gets shut down by our city. And a lot of us went crazy because it could have been argued that that was discrimination. So where could discrimination in other ways, not just the enforcement, come into play? It could be on, Jack, you brought up the fact that certain businesses with the change get a great reduction in parking. Certain businesses, just by the type, don't get a great reduction. You could look at business types and a business person could say this parking change is discriminatory. You need the city clerk to like look this over to see if certain businesses don't get as big of a parking reduction for something that could be related to race. I don't know. I am not an expert. I can see Paul kind of squinting, being like, it's a tough thing to say, but like, just think about our zoning and our building and unit size could be discriminatory towards families, could be there are tons of ways that what we are doing on the development side on the surface appears like it's not discriminatory, but then you can get discriminatory consequences. So we have to just be careful with this policy. The other thing is if we reduce the parking, we let the market kind of take its way and business owners try. We know that more people are going to not park in our business sectors. They're going to go right into the neighborhoods. How are we going to handle that as a city? There is a norm that parking is available all over our city and that you could park very close to your house if you wanted to. You could also park very close to any business establishment that you want to go to. And that is slowly changing, that people now have to park a block away, 2 blocks away. People attending or going to our businesses don't traditionally park near our residential. That will start to happen. So how as a city are we going to deal with the changing norms that will happen because we're doing more business development in part related to the change in parking? So again, I think that's maybe it's not an unintended consequence, but it's a consequence I don't think we've thoroughly thought out if we greatly reduce the parking requirements. And Brent brought in it's one thing, we actually have parking that's not well regulated, it's haphazard. We need a uniform policy. I would like to see, if we have a policy change like this, it is almost across the board for all businesses. Because then it's not discriminatory about any type of business. But then we know there are going to be some businesses that are really popular. Northside Social, we just went over that. Like they have a lot of people that drive in and then all of a sudden they're being popular, but now it's crowding out parking for other businesses. So by not regulating it, we have actually discriminated, or not discriminated, but we've made it harder for other businesses. So we got to think about that. What businesses are popular that may get a reduction in parking, but we know people are going to be driving there. They're going to gobble up all these other spots, and then there are going to be other businesses that just don't have parking, and they're going to lose out. And I know that we don't always think about that with our building. Like, we build out around the city and we want mixed use, and we think this is great, but we don't realize that, like, a mixed-use building with new commercial spaces is going to bring in a new business that's going to crowd out one of our existing businesses. I just feel like with this parking and the fact that some businesses get a reduction, some don't, it's just going to lead to unintended consequences by putting pressure on some businesses that need our help, that maybe need more parking, and now they don't have the parking near their site. What do? They don't have it on site. They're not going to have it off site. It's just going to be a problem. So how do we make sure this policy doesn't hurt some businesses? We think it's going to help stimulate some new businesses, but then what is it going to do to our existing businesses and the parking that they rely on that may be gobbled up? Meaning, the off-street parking. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm being clear, because I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but does that make sense?
So just to clarify, and I'm not sure this comes through clearly in our staff materials, but the reduction would apply for every business with the caveat that the parking requirement is based on square footage of use, right? So some things, there are some ridiculous ones that where it's right, like bus service is counted on the number of bus bays, but we don't have any bus service bays. But there are other things. It's in the parking table. Most uses are calculated based off of square footage. Salons, restaurants, eateries, things like offices, they're all counted on.
Paul, it still could have unintended consequences. We give loans out by a whole set of criteria that looks non-discriminatory, but our lending is discriminatory. I'm telling you that the criteria in which this is, and I'm not an expert in parking or this, but I'm just saying, we need to look at and understand, just because you're saying square footage, and that seems like a very neutral, uniform, undiscriminatory factor that you're using to determine this, it could be discriminatory in its implementation. Think about that, research it, look at the different businesses that fall in these different categories, who attends them, who owns them, and look, there might be. I'm not saying there is, I'm just saying there's been tons of policies that have good intentions, have unintended consequences, and sometimes they fall along racial lines. This could be one.
Sure, we'll
that
take
we
a look
don't
at
know
that.
about.
The other thing I'll sort of say that part of what this also, this amendment is tended to do is to provide to provide certainty, right? By saying that every business qualifies, it removes some of that, the oddities of specifically what happened with the La Tangaria situation. Like, oh, you apply, you do count, you don't count. It depends on the argument you make. Some of this is saying that if you're a business and you want to set up shop in the city, then great. And here are the requirements. It makes it very clear for people trying to move in. Maybe the other thing, just to clarify, is that this reduction is calculated at time of occupancy, not at time of construction. So at time of construction, the rules that are on the books today would be the same ones that apply going forward. So when someone comes in to construct a new building, we would still calculate the parking requirements same as we do today. This would only be calculated at time of actual occupancy. And that's how this really is geared to be only for existing buildings, not new construction. But yes, we will. Your point is well made, and we'll take a look at it.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, I would just to respond to your point, Mr. Hyra, I think it's very possible that the parking requirements for the different uses that are currently existing, perhaps the same as they were in 1969, are discriminatory. This policy is not going to remediate that. It's not going to, I think we do have, council has requested a bigger look at commercial parking requirements, and that is coming hopefully sometime in the next year, perhaps. Not sure exactly of the timeline of that, but so I think there will be a bigger look at this. I see this personally as like kind of dipping a toe in. It's a very limited, narrow change that might hopefully generate new businesses in the city. I think we'll be able to see businesses, I hope, from a lot of different kinds of people, you know, who can't make it work with the required parking that we have now, would actually be able to open up in the city with this policy. So I'm supportive. I think there's lots of details, but I think maybe what you're getting at, the sort of discriminatory nature, that's already baked into like our current code, existing code, and that is something that we need to look at. But this policy, I don't think exacerbates that, except for the point you made about sort of unintended consequences of people gobbling it. But it also provides opportunity, right, for new businesses to be able to come in.
Can I just say one thing? And I think this will make the example, I hope, a little clearer. You're absolutely right that past discrimination is baked into our entire country, this town, and we try to do things to address it. And this is just a quick example. We built public housing. It was discriminatory. And then we thought to alleviate that discrimination, we should knock them down. And there were people that thought that was the right policy to help alleviate the harms of the past. Knocking down the public housing in the way that we did made it worse. So, but everyone had good intentions of knocking it down that was to help people in the public housing, address the harms of the past. This might help open up opportunities for small businesses that are minority owned that didn't have the wherewithal to pay for all that parking that was mandated. And so we've reduced it, so maybe this will help diversify the business ownership in our town and help people with lower income levels open up. I'm saying it might make things worse. We don't know, and I'm just saying, even if we have the right intentions and we feel and we have this assumption this is going to be good, people thought building the public housing would be good. That would alleviate poverty. Then they thought knocking it down would make it good, and that made it worse. So let's just be careful with all of our assumptions as we move through and try to do policies that we think are doing the right thing to address harms of the past.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that's a great perspective we should all bring to all of the work that we do here as a planning commission. I guess I would just, I think, you know, we will need to proceed thoughtfully, but I do take some comfort in the fact that I see this as a pretty narrow and limited test of, you know, what reducing some amount of parking. It's not even like you're getting rid of all the parking altogether. You know, a lot of these uses may be bigger, so there will still be some required or someone that's already existing or provided. You're just not asking for the full amount that our outdated codes are requiring us to ask. So, just to say that. And it's funny that Northside was raised earlier as like kind of a failure, because I almost see that as like a success in terms of like what Mr. Duncan was talking about earlier with the market working it out, right? This planning commission approved Northside. The city came in and added some public parking on the streets. Northside negotiated with the condo across the street for that strip of spaces right there. I haven't heard about any sort of, and I think also the community adjusted. And the same thing really happened with La Tangeria. That was a really hot use. It was super popular. There were a lot of people coming and patronizing because everybody was excited. It opened. And I think they're still doing great business, but it's not the same crush of people now that West Westmoreland was experiencing in the beginning. And I think the community in that neighborhood adjusted to having a really excellent taco restaurant at the end of their street. And so I do think I'm a believer, you know, to an extent in the market working these things out. I think Godfrey's is another example. Godfrey's is super popular. I assume they have the parking that was required. I don't know if they received some sort of reduction or something like that. I don't think they came through us, but you know, they were so popular, they put a valet service. So it's like, yeah, they will work it out. If business owners want to succeed, you know, they will provide the parking necessary to do that, I think, or they will I don't know. I don't feel like we as a city should make it harder for them to even get out of the starting gates. And I think that the current policies that we have in terms of the parking that we're requiring do that. And then I guess the other thing I would say, as I agree with Mr. Krasner, I'm not a fan of the permit parking that we've been putting in. I think I've said that before. I think a lot of it is just like overnight parking. So many of these areas is 2-hour parking during the day. I think Lawton is
Lawns all the time.
all the time, so, but whatever.
At least
It's
during the week, I
Lawton.
think.
So like, but I'm not a fan philosophically of these. I think these are public streets and they should be available to the public and they should be available to support the businesses. If you're lucky enough to live within walking distance of our commercial areas, you should expect to have people parking on your street. That's my perspective on it. And not everybody, a lot of people won't agree with me, but that's how I feel about it. Build a bigger driveway. So, that's probably going to be quoted somewhere, I'm sure. I did have a couple questions. I would agree with the EDA on their recommendation to raise it to 1,200. I was thinking even 1,250. I mean, 1,000 is a nice round number, but I just, if you can make it a little larger, that might help even more potential businesses get off the ground here. On Mr. Krasner's question, I mean, like imagining some sort of like, I don't know, 10,000 square foot. I don't know if we have any existing 10,000 square foot buildings. We do, actually. I mean, there are some pretty large existing buildings that do have like parking lots, but have lots of like individual uses. I wonder, to address the question you raised, like, do we need some sort of max building size or something like that this would apply to? I'm not really in favor of making it more restrictive, but that's just something that I thought of when you were.
I mean, one idea I had to deal with that, I mean, what if instead of doing it by use, I mean, whatever the number is, 1,000 square feet, what if it's by use, like that category of use? So if you have 2 restaurants that come in, that the 1,000 square foot's for the building, like the first 1,000 square feet of that type of use in the building, whether it's occupied by 2 restaurants or 1. So that, because otherwise I feel like, that's how you would get into trouble potentially. Like, if you just say, okay, it's the first 1,000 square feet of that use. I mean, I don't know what we do here. I know in the county, they do something where they require something called a parking tabulation. Every site has a parking tabulation, and if you have multiple uses, it's characterized by the uses, and it's like an Excel spreadsheet, and you add it up, and you get to the number at the end, and you see if you make it or you don't. But what if and it's by category of use that have the same rates. I mean, what if we did it that way, so that you didn't just have, I know it's unlikely, but if you had a number of individual uses that were all under the 1,000, next thing you know, there is you have I don't know, a large number of different businesses operating and with very little parking, and then it leads to the spillover and the other problems. I don't know, maybe that's a more reasonable way to do it. Look at the site itself, not the C of O for that, exactly, but for the entire building. You add them up. I don't know. How have you guys thought of that? As opposed to doing it individually, because that way that would avoid it. That way, the building, the property owner, it's one building. The property owner is getting the break. The first 1,000 square feet of that use is, not counted. It doesn't matter who's using it. Whether there's one business that's making up that 1,000 or 3. But that way you don't have I don't know. I think that might avoid some problems like that. I don't know every building this would apply to. Because I know, it's not shopping centers, it's not, the newer stuff. It's mostly these older, smaller sites. Mm-hmm. Most, a lot of which have some parking, some don't. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, so yeah. And the other thing I would add too, that it was alluded to by my colleagues, is just that, right? Obviously, the more successful some of our businesses get, I mean, people obviously come from far outside our borders and they are going to drive. So we have to acknowledge that. I mean, there's going to be some, and yeah, people do figure it out and it works out, but we can avoid sort of the angst that even in the short term, a few months of angst like we did with La Tingeria and with some of these other, and with Northside Social and others, we could avoid some of that, or at least introducing that with this ordinance. That would be good. So just something to think about. Maybe look at it that way.
One more thing.
Yeah.
That I didn't think about before. So when we change the use of land, it changes its economic value. We are assuming that if we change the parking regulation, that we will attract more businesses. Do we know yet, if we change this, what it will do to the land? Will it change the land value? Do you understand? Like, so it's easier for business entry. These owners have to rent this stuff out. If they think they can rent it out to more people, there's more demand, they will raise the price of the rental, but also that will probably trigger something in the land value. When we did the T-zones and we changed the density, we changed the land value like that. And I'm just wondering, even though this might be small, what will it do that? Do we know that? Have we talked to some of these owners? I mean, if the EDA is pushing for this and less regulation, it's related to development, I mean, economic development. And I'm just curious if we went to even the people that, the examples that you gave, and just ask them, the landowner, what do you think if we change this? What do you think the value, will it change the actual market value of this price of the land, of the building?
I will say that, just to clarify, it's not the EDA that pushed the proposal, it was actually city staff. One of the things
No, but you went to them. You told us that you went to them and
Correct.
presented, and they gave
Yeah.
comments. That's what I'm not saying this
sure.
proposal came from them. I'm saying when you brought it to them, they've already commented on it. They seem to be in favor, and they wanted to reduce it
Right.
even more, the parking regulation.
No, it's a conversation that I mean, some of this is anecdotal, right? And we can pull more data on this, but I've certainly heard the stories, right, where someone wants to be a small business owner. They've already signed into a lease. They're submitting their permits for tenant fit out. And then someone says, I'm sorry, you don't meet the parking requirements. And so you see these small business owners that are then stuck, that they are in a lease for a space that they can't occupy. They're already paying soft costs to try and get in and start setting up shop. And that's really what this is intended to do, is to remove a barrier to business entry in the economy. So that's what motivated it. But I think there are some good points that have been raised tonight, and obviously we need to look at those before we bring this back.
That's a good answer, but you didn't answer my question. Have you asked, or is there any analysis that has been done, when and if we change this, what will it do to the value of land where we have these commercial buildings? Have you done that analysis yet? Have you even thought about it?
We haven't done any specific, analysis to that effect or talked to folks, but it's a great recommendation.
Yeah, just like we as a planning commission asked the planning staff to find out before the T-zones change, and we said, what is likely if we change this to be built here, and what will it cost? I'm going to ask you the same thing. Could you do that to some of the business owners here that own these plots, that the parking will change and be reduced, and just ask them what they think about what that might do to the price of the building? There are a lot of things that change prices of buildings. This is one small little thing, but I'd be interested, and I think it would be interesting for our city if we change this and we bring in greater economic development. How much more tax base will it bring in? I would think Wyatt would want to know. I think council would want to know. I would want to know. So before we change policy, let's do some fiscal analysis. We do it all the time. Do it on this one, please.
So I had a couple other requests too. One is like, can we? It may be in the. I couldn't bring up the report from the consultant, but do you have a map of our public parking, including 2-hour street parking? That might be helpful. And Kaiser, George Mason Square, other places where the city has like kind of either formal or informal agreements, I guess. I think it would be helpful to see all the places where there already is public parking. I think one of the great things about the Broad and Washington development has been people are actually using Kaiser now, like very regularly. And I think, again, that's the sort of like adaptation that the community had to go through. I can't just go and park behind Clarendon's. I have to go park at Kaiser and then walk across the street. And everybody is now doing that. I see it all the time. I've been doing it myself, and it's perfectly fine. So I think that might be a helpful piece of information. You have that handy. A map of the shopping centers. I think council might have requested that. I think that would be helpful too. the centers that have the 8 businesses or more, so which would not be. So and I don't know if you have a map of all the buildings that would be potentially eligible for this, but that also might be helpful, just to see kind of like where are the buildings that might be eligible for this, who is excluded because they're, shopping centers or whatever, and then where is the sort of public parking that we have available, both in our neighborhoods that abut these areas, but also, in our actual, city public parking in the downtown area. The other thing that was raised by council was ADA requirements, and I think the question was, are ADA requirement parking also going to be reduced? And I think, Mr. Stoddard, you replied that those are required under the ADA, and so like that there would be no change. But I wonder if should be a mention of that in here somewhere. Yeah. I don't know. I just to affirm that there would be no change to the ADA requirements, it might be good to add that.
Yeah, yes, we'll look at it again and confirm, but as noted here, sort of there's a parking schedule in ADA that says, if you have this many spots, then you have to have this many accessible spaces, and if you get to this many spots, then so many of them have to be van accessible. So there's a schedule, and it's not based on use type, and it's a national standard that says, for the number of spaces that are overall on the site, then so many of them.
So if you only have like 4, for example, or 7 or
Well,
something.
the first one always has to be ADA.
So there's always one.
Well, if there are any on the site,
If
then
there
the
are
first
any.
one is ADA, yeah.
Okay, so maybe that's fine. I think that was all for me. Is there anything else anybody else wants to request, raise,
One thought
respond
comes to, first off, thank you for advising the electeds of the, angst that we would like to help them avoid. But it is parking, and it's like housing. There's going to be angst. Just is. It's the way it is. Life goes on, and people get all worked up, and many times it works out. Tingery is hopefully a good example. Northside Social. I mean, there are, by and large, it seems like there are some success stories. And we haven't even talked about the cheese sandwich place. Why can't I think of the name of it?
Oh, Space Bar?
Space Bar.
Oh, Space Bar,
Thank you.
excellent.
I mean, when that place opened and I went and it's packed, and I thought, well, where in the
Still
world?
packed.
I might be there tonight after the
Where in
meeting.
the world? If I'll shut up, you'll get there in time to.
All the meetings.
Exactly. But, I remember when it opened, thinking, well, where's everybody going to park? There's only like 5 spaces, and they share it with the frame shop, but yet it's worked out.
Yeah.
And I think Godfrey's a good example. Who knew you could, valet park a bakery, because there are pockets of available parking in the structured buildings that are going unused, and that's money, and somebody will figure out how to make money out of that somewhere along the lines. I mean, without becoming Bethesda, which we won't ever become because we don't have a metro that runs right down the heart.
Sadly.
But, we are going to face some of the growing pains that Bethesda faced basically in the 80s. I mean, when I lived there in the early 80s, it was like a sleepy southern town, and then all of a sudden the restaurants discovered the rents were cheap, and they began to flood the zone with great restaurants, and you could get to them, and then everybody in the whole metro area discovered it, and you couldn't find a parking place to save your life. And they built a parking garage, and that solved it, and some miniature version of that may happen here. The Kaiser, that's another interesting success story. I mean, in terms of providing information to other groups that are going to consider this, I would encourage us to, have 5 or 6 cases that I've mentioned and you all have mentioned, just to remind us that, life can go on being lived even if parking minimums are adjusted. The 2-hour parking in residential neighborhoods that's a related but even stickier wicket, because people have built their lives around the fact that they have a second car at Winter Hill. When Winter Hill was built, probably most of the people who lived there had one car, if that. They may have taken a bus down to the Pentagon. And that's not true now. Now you've got the usual number of, single occupancy vehicles, and they got to go someplace. So that's, information that needs to be processed concurrently but separately, I think, from what we're trying to do here, because my understanding of this is it's supposed to be a quick and simple, let's try this out. And what we're finding is that nothing in the bill here is quick and simple. But it could be done. I mean, council's already passed it once, right? There's a number out there. Maybe we can adjust the number, provide some more information to help people feel comfortable with what we're going to experiment with. And if it doesn't work, it's something that we can change.
To Mr. Duncan's comments, I wanted to add two other examples. I mean, it's really just one, but with Thompson and, the building there and the State Theater, Clarendon's, like, we adjusted on the fly, like parking to accommodate those two businesses while the building is going up. And then also, I'm pretty sure they're getting parking in the building. But just the thing is that we worked that. Like, the city worked with the planning commission worked out. So these things, I'd be careful about leaving it to the market, because it's never left to the market. We intervene to help accommodate businesses to make sure they can be successful. And I know we're trying to do a policy that will lead to more business success, but we always will have to be intervening and adjusting on the fly. And we've done it with all the examples you laid out, and then even more. But it is, like you said, it's controversial. It's never clean cut. It's never simple. It's never easy. And I don't think implementing this policy, no matter how clean it looks, will be easy. It'll be difficult. And so bringing as much information to bear, and analysis and thought to the unintended consequences would be good, because that will prep the city to intervene when they're going to have to, if this gets passed, because there's going to be bumps in the road.
Great, thank you all. I guess the last thing I'd say is, like, when I weigh the trade-offs of sort of like the negative outcomes of this policy, maybe more people parking in our neighborhoods against the negative outcome of not having these older buildings be put to a productive, like, economic use and contribute to the vitality of our town. Like, I think that's the worst outcome in my mind. That's my personal perspective as a single-family homeowner who lives on a residential street. So I think that's, I'm willing to take that risk to support the us achieving our vision of being a walkable community with a thriving local business community. That's my goal, and we'll see if this helps us get there, if it passes. Anyway, thank you all. Any other final comments? Thoughts? Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Trainer.
Thank you.
So next on the agenda is Planning Commissioner reports. Mr. Hyra, how's the affordable work group going? Affordable living. I missed you at the last meeting.
Well, thank you for going to the first two. I made it to the second two, and we're working. We're trying to adjust the affordable living policy, which is basically the affordable housing policy. And we have a lot of different opinions about what should we be doing on the affordable housing front. How can we do better, do more? Do we preserve? Do we build? Do we do subsidies for renters? Do we do subsidies for affordable home ownership? I mean, there's just a lot of things that we could do, but I think that at the end of the day, I hope that what comes out of this group, and this is my personal opinion, but some of the members agree, is like getting our city to agree to put some of the operating budget, yearly operating budget, into affordable housing, into our affordable housing fund. And then we'll figure out what's the best way to deploy those resources. But with such minimal resources coming out of our operating budget, it's very hard to do much. The other part is that we have been doing mixed use, I would say mixed use, it's not really mixed income, mixed use development all over our city in the last 10 years that Commissioner Duncan has been supporting, and a lot of people have been supporting, and it's a good thing. But as I mentioned earlier on the meeting, we don't have a lot of affordable units in them. We have some, and it went from 6%, and some have 10% of the units at an affordable level. And I think there's a willingness to go higher, to see if we can get that number to officially be in our policy at officially at 10%, maybe officially at 12%, and see what happens, and see if we can get development to continue while asking developers to do more on the affordable housing front. And if just those two things happened out of this series of meetings that we updated the policy, handed it off to council, and then council approved it with some percent of the operating budget going to the affordable housing fund and going from 6 to 10 to 12% of affordable units in our big mixed use developments that go forward, that to me would be a huge win, and would say that this group has accomplished something. But I don't know if that's going to happen, because there's a lot of other things that this group also wants to do, which I think is great, but I don't know if we can stick all these other pieces in. And even if we stick other pieces into the update on the affordable living policy, it still has to go to council, and they've got the final say over what really is in the updated policy. But I'm glad we're updating it, and I'm glad the city put forth resources to hire a facilitator and to make a commitment to updating the policy, which is outdated. Just like we updated the demographics and we talked about that, we have to update our affordable policy and strengthen it. But it's messy and it's hard, and we can't get agreement, and we'll just see what we do finally agree on at the end of the summer. But I'm hoping I think at the end of the summer we'll have a rewritten policy that I think will come before us on the Planning Commission, and then we'll also go before council. So we'll get our say as a commission on that.
Well, thank you for all of the time and thought and expertise you're bringing to this. We really appreciate you contributing. Mr. Duncan.
This is in the nature of a question. Thank you, yes, for carrying that heavy load. So I'm still learning about how we're processing all these various balls that are up in the air. My understanding is that the group you're talking about, the Affordable Living Group, has a mandate that's broader than just housing and a deadline and so forth, and that's good. The Virginia Village deal, as I understood from the EDA meeting last night, is still not yet consummated, and now there's sometime in July hope that will occur, and we can then start the clock on that process, which, as I understand it, is supposed to have a group of people who are going to meet and specifically talk about what are we going to do with Virginia Village. And that's good, and I hope it happens, this July, because it was supposed to happen last July and maybe even the July before that. I'm a little impatient with getting started talking about what we're going to do with Virginia Village, because I see, the units that we put in the mixed use have been good, as you say, but they're basically just treading water unless we are able to establish, a development that really moves the numbers in the multiple dozens, if not hundreds, to make up for the fact that the market is just making everything more expensive everywhere else, places that are market affordable, like Merrill House, begin eventually to creep out of being market affordable, and we've got to make some serious headway in terms of numbers. And Virginia Village is the best opportunity, I think, and the Fields too, of course, which is its own thing. So thanks for bird dogging all that. I did have an unrelated question for the staff. There was a reference last night to an event at Insights Broad and Washington Project on June the 20th, I think, some sort of, ULI type group that's meeting to talk about something that seemed interesting. Could you let us know about that and ask if planning commissioners might be allowed to go? There may be a cost involved, so we might have to set a cap on who could go. It's in the afternoon, I think, on June 20th. So that's just a request for information. And thank you for sending the notice about the ribbon cutting at the Home 2 Suites. Home 2 Suites? Wasn't able to go, but it was nice to hear that they had an event. Actually, when they said they were going to, they said they were going to do it on the end of May, and by gum, they opened up the doors and had paying clients at the end of May. So that's great. If there are ever any other ribbon cuttings, hopefully they'll give us a little more warning than they were able to give anybody this time. But it's good that we had that event because the West Falls project is obviously very important, and continued progress through the year on all the components of it are something that we should keep our eye on.
Great, thank you. Any updates from you, Mr. President?
No updates other than waving to Mr. Duncan during the Memorial Day Parade on the float. He looked good up there. My daughter, after I explained how I knew that man up on the float, said, "Why doesn't the Planning Commission have a float in the Memorial Day Parade? These other groups can have a float. The library used to have a thing." And I said, "Well," and I said to her, "I'm like, well, what should we do up on the float?" She's like, "Well, just throw candy out." And I said, "Well, yeah, we could have, so, we'll think about that for next year. I'm gonna, ask the staff to think about ideas for a float for us for next year."
There you go. There we go. Sadly, we're banned from throwing candy now.
Okay.
We had hoped to do that as well, but it was the decree was sent down. Well, they're concerned about people getting run over by.
Public Works was there. I mean, why can't the Planning Commission, or at least the Planning Department, be out with a float for the
Now
parade?
we've got not only the go-karts, but we've got Bikinetic, and we've got, we got a lot of people on wheels who are going up and down a very crowded area, and having kids out scrambling after candy is considered unsafe. It's just,
Now I know why my daughter didn't go this year. She loves that parade, goes every year. And this year she's like, "Dad, I'm not that interested." And then I was like, but now maybe she got wind. No more candy. So she's.
Well, kids handed out candy. Kids walked over at the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. And
yeah, right. There was some flag handing out that was safe.
Mr. Duncan did not hand out any candy, but I still waved to him. He looked good up there. And he's happy to see him.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all. I don't have any updates myself. I was out of town last week.
We should do a booth next year if we don't do a parade event.
Yeah.
Now we can hand out candy.
So I think the next item on the agenda is the director's report. Mr. Stoddard.
Thank you. Let's see, as always, I'll start with the look ahead. I never want to catch commissioners by surprise. So if we're able to go to the second page, back of your agenda, some of these I want to confirm. So looking at the next meeting, in observance of Juneteenth, the next regular meeting of the commission will be held on June 26th. So rather than our usual third Wednesday of the month, we'll hold it on the fourth Wednesday of the month. And we've got listed here in the look ahead that commercial parking would come back to you on June 26th, but the respond by date by council is actually in early August. So I'll double check this schedule and make sure we've got the right date. The second item, we've actually moved that in response to staff workload. There was we've received another T-zone townhouse application. This is for the property at the intersections of Park and Lee. They're actually calling the project Lee and Park, so I'll just have to get used to saying that.
They have the big sign up there on the corner. I was wondering when we were going to see that site plan.
Yeah, I want to reach out to them and make sure they're sort of clearly advertising where they are in the application process. They only just submitted, so there are no project approvals at this point. Staff review of the application is ongoing. Your first work session on that as a site plan application is scheduled actually for July 17th. So not June 26th, but July 17. And as is typical for our protocols now on site plan and subdivision applications, we'll have yard signs up advertising your first work session date. Let's see, on June 26th, this is an item that is certain on your schedule, and that is that we'll be doing the kickoff with you all for our next comprehensive plan chapter review and update, and it is for the facilities and utilities chapter. That one was updated about 20 years ago, so it's certainly due for a look. Obviously, the ongoing conversation about sewer capacity is certainly important to the city, but I know there are other requirements and concerns we have about the reliability of electricity when the power goes out. Where are we on water pressure within the city? There is a requirement in state code to have a plan to provide broadband access for everybody. Even though we don't provide it ourselves, we do need to think about, is broadband available generally throughout the community? So a range of things we need to be thinking about. So that'll be kicking off with you all. Same as we've done with previous chapter updates, we'll bring to you our industry scan of what other communities are doing with their chapters. We'll bring the existing chapter that's on the books, as well as progress made against the goals that were listed there, and then chart a course for not only the substance that we want to explore, but also public engagement and a schedule. July 7th, the July 3rd meeting, this was talked about last time, canceling that meeting, given that the following day is July 4th, so we would have had hard time getting quorum even if we could hold the meeting due to staff availability. July 17 then would be your only regular meeting in July, where you would have, as I mentioned, your first work session on Lee and Park, as well as a work session on the accessory dwelling units proposed revisions. And obviously we'll look to work in this commercial parking schedule as well. So that's the look ahead. Are there any questions on the look ahead? Hearing none. In the director's report, this is one I like. I've been trying to report on this every year since I got wind of it, and that is the Trust for Public Land every year releases park scores for various communities. And thank you to Jack for preparing this summary. So that this park score looks at a range of inputs. It looks at access to parks, so how many people can get to a park within 10 minutes, how much acreage of the community is committed to parkland, how much are communities investing in parks, what are the amenities that are available, are parks available to everyone in the community, looking at race and income. It was, what is it, DC took the #1 spot this year, Arlington took the #5 spot, Minneapolis and St. Paul historically also do very well, and so those communities are regularly in the top scores, and you can go to the web link there. Falls Church does do well on some of the scores, perhaps not a surprise given the city's size and walkability. 98% of city residents are within a 10-minute walk of a park, which is really a tremendous percentage. And this relates to the second item. I wanted to give you all an update on the Parklets project. So included in the report is actually the latest designs for the parklets, but actually before I get to that, Mr. Trainer, if we're able to pull up the attachment, because I want to get back to the sort of the why behind the parklets, and I'll move through this quickly. This is an older presentation, but it was in September of 22 when staff was proposing to the Economic Development Authority that ARPA dollars be invested to improve these parklets throughout the community. If you go to the next page, you'll see the basic definition of what are parklets. So they're smaller than traditional parks. They're less than an acre in size and usually much smaller than an acre. And really it's looking at spaces that aren't well used in the community and really thinking about how can those become gathering spaces and really sort of attract new uses and breathe new life into a neighborhood. We had on the next slide, you'll see at the time we were proposing 4 parklets, one where South Maple and South Washington, it's quite difficult to see on the screen. But at the intersection of South Washington and South Maple, one across from the, one across from the recently constructed Transit Plaza at Washington and Hillwood, another at an existing park today where Annandale and South Washington come together, and then a fourth at the really just the corner of that half acre of open space in front of City Hall. So obviously not the whole half acre, but just a portion at the corner. Ultimately, the EDA did approve use of the ARPA funds for 3 of those parklets, the 3 along South Washington. If we go to the next page, let's see. So great. This map is showing sort of those 4 red stars are showing the locations proposed. Design elements, if we go to the next slide, this was the conceptual design, and really what we were looking at is how do we bring all the elements of a park into these things? How do we bring something that's visually interesting, create a focal point for activity and interest, provide both sun and shade, create some sort of definition so they don't just spill off into the street. This was the original design for the Triangle Park at Washington and Maple, and their revised design since then. I'll show you those. And this is sort of, again, the next slide, getting to the why of it, just how many businesses are within range of this parklet. Next slide. This is sort of a site plan view, and again, this has been revised, and the revised design is in the director's report. Next is City Hall. We can skip this one, except to say, again, to reiterate, there was never the intention to pave the entire lawn area in front of City Hall. It really was, if you go to the next slide, you'll see it really was intended as quite a small gathering space that I think would still be meaningful. Next slide, this is the alleyway across from, that's the existing conditions, this is across from the Transit Plaza. You can see the conceptual design, and we obviously refined this one. And then last up is the Washington and Maple. This was sort of an early conceptual design on the next slide. And again, this also shifted, given that there's an existing rain garden in this proposed location, so we worked around that. So if we go back, but again, what is the purpose of this thing? It really is to rejuvenate these neighborhoods and take what's already public land and invest in it to make it a nicer place for everyone in the community. If we go to the director's report, so if we go to the first site plan design, so this is the redo of so this is the latest revision for that Maple and Washington site. So that path that's sort of moving diagonally off to the top of the page and to the left, that's an existing mulch trail that runs along the west side of Trips Run. And so this would actually tie that mulch path in and make it easier for people to find. It would keep, it's designed to avoid the critical root zones of the existing trees throughout the area, to tie into the existing sidewalk, and provide benches and tables and seating, and a pleasant gathering space there along South Maple. To the right, immediately off picture, is the bridge crossing Trips Run, and then the parking lot for Cavalier Trail Park. If we go to the next one, this is the Triangle Park. So this is the refined design, but it's Washington Street, you can see labeled diagonally on the bottom, and then Annandale, in the picture anyway, running vertically up and down. And so the idea is to take what is today a very narrow asphalt path with a lot of bumps and bends to it, straighten that out and level it so that it is ADA accessible, introduce picnic benches underneath a pergola behind that walkway, and then benches on the other side, so providing seating options and obviously trash and recycling at all these locations. And then if we go to the next one, so this one is a little bit more involved. This would be the alleyway, and really making this sort of quite the space with sort of a stage that could be used in the middle of the picture there for gatherings or performances, seating areas, and then as well as string lighting shown with the cross X's there. And so that's the latest sort of concepts, and I just wanted to share those with you as they're proceeding through final design and hopefully into construction in short order.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the timeline was, one of these was like next month or this month?
Yep.
later this month?
And I think one of the things we want to do is, well, that's what we're hoping. I think one of the things we want to do is maybe rethink coming out of this, how are we approaching some of these smaller investments, that these are, in essence, landscaping projects, and there are a number of landscaping firms throughout the region that could implement these based off just the drawings we have here. And so I think that's one of the things we want to look at as a city process. Do we have the structure in place to actually deliver some of these smaller things? A lot of our sort of on-call contracts are geared at paving, curb and gutter, brick sidewalks. We don't have necessarily a great path for quickly delivering on these things that sometimes can be more difficult to do than maybe it should be.
Makes sense. Yeah, so hardscape, landscape kind of services on call. Yeah. Great.
So you mentioned this is ARPA funds, and it's been approved, right? These are all, how much, like for these four, what's the cost total about?
I can double check. I will double check on those numbers.
Great. Any other thoughts, questions? No. Mr. Trainer, do we have any correspondence? I think that's the last item.
No, we don't.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that is it. So we can adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you. 15 minutes early. Look at this. Woohoo!